Alrighty, it is time to look at the 82-83 season. So, and once again, randomness all over the place, right? So let's take a look at the 82-83 season. And again, I did the videos on season by season last summer, and now I'm kind of adding notes to all of those seasons. And 82-83 was the last year that the New York Islanders win the Stanley Cup. They held the Oilers to 6 goals in the finals, and Hockey News Annual that year is just all drive to 5. Here's how the Islanders are going to hit 5. Who can stop them? The Oilers were seen as the one team that might be able to, but the problem for the Oilers was defense and goaltending. They didn't seem to have Islander levels of either. So for the Islanders, it's a dominant performance, and it just looks like they are up here, and the rest of the league is just fighting over who's going to lose to them. Pete Peters has his big year here. He wins the Vezina. He has 40 wins on the season and 8 shutouts. 8. And this is during live puck era. This is where lots of goalies have goals against of above 4, 4.5, and he's putting up 8 shutouts like it's no big deal. And there's a tragedy that occurs this season that we don't talk about. Norman Levier, who was a good prospect for the Boston Bruins and came in before this season very proud that he was learning English, and he was really proud to be a Boston Bruin. Well, during a game in Vancouver on October 23rd, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage in between periods, and he ends up partially paralyzed. He never plays the game again. So we talk about certain things that happen, and man, that's tragic. And that was a big one. That was a solid young prospect for Boston who, out of nowhere, his career was over. So that was tough. And so when you see his card, you're looking through all the hockey cards and go, who's this guy? That's who he was. The Flyers. They finished first in the Patrick division, 10 points ahead of the New York Islanders. Just clearing away the best team in the division, and they get swept in the first round by the Rangers. So in this day and age, being swept in the first round is the equivalent to missing the playoffs, and it results in some changes when these things happen to teams. So the Flyers kind of in flux and trying to get back to where they were in 75 without any success. The Capitals. Did you ever think the Capitals might have been in danger of being moved? They were. The Capitals were losing money, and they weren't doing well on the ice either. So on the ice, bad. Off the ice, bad. Owner Abe Pollin, tired of losing money, threatened to move the team to Tacoma. So if this had happened, we're not looking at Seattle as an expansion team. But the good news is, on the ice, the product gets better thanks to what they just call the trade, where Rod Langway is added to that blue line, and immediately the Washington Capitals are much better. Langway's the best defenseman in the league, and Montreal's in trouble. So Langway ends up moving. I mentioned a couple videos ago about he was one of the guys who wasn't happy with the organization, and there were rumors about whether or not he might be on his way out. Sure enough, he was. The New Jersey Devils get faint praise because they only win 17 games that year, but they don't panic. So general manager who'd been known for panic moves with the Colorado Rockies, here's a draft pick, give us a veteran. Here's another draft pick, give us a, come on, we gotta do this. And in this case, he's like, all right, we're just going to have to go through this. And he won't live to see the team relevant as general manager. As former general manager, he can sit in the crowd and go, they're good now. It would be Lou Lamoriello who would turn things around. So this is why when people point to GMs and go, why aren't they more patient? Part of the reason why. Those really patient GMs go, yeah, we're just going to wait it out. Sometimes they get replaced by somebody else when things start to turn around. And that's what happens with Jersey. Scotty Bowman. And again, we talk about Buffalo and how Bowman wasn't as successful there as elsewhere. He does something smart here. He drafts Phil Housley, but then he declares him the next Bobby Orr, which leaves people at the draft going, that might be a bit high. The thing is, Housley, Hall of Famer. So Bowman, yeah, he overreaches by saying the next Bobby Orr, but whatever. It's fine. Hyperbole's great. And Housley does turn out to be a pretty solid addition. And I wonder when I'm looking at this series and I look at Bowman's career, like if he had stayed in Buffalo, would they have been a Stanley Cup champion? If they'd given him some more time, would they have become a Stanley Cup champion? And I have a funny feeling the answer is yes, because everywhere he goes, teams win. We'll get to that as the series continues. And of course, people will say, well, he coached some great teams in Pittsburgh, Detroit, Montreal. True, but you still got to get him over that line. And as we've seen with teams in recent years, it has to be the right coach to get those teams over the line. The Montreal Canadiens are swept by the Sabres in round one, which had to feel good for Scotty Bowman. And Serge Savard actually retires from the Jets to move into a management role with the Habs. So Ronald Corey, seeing that things are falling apart, got to get somebody in there, and we're going to see the retirement of Guy Lafleur not too long from now. But this is why things had to change, because Montreal, Stanley Cup champions almost every year during the 70s, but in the 80s, things looked bad for them. And they just look older and tired. And then you look at the Langway deal, and when they do make a trade, they seem to find a way to lose it. So Montreal struggling. There's a kid that'll come up for them eventually that'll make a difference, but not yet. Winnipeg. Stop me if you've heard this one before. The Jets are complaining about losing money. And the owner says, I get a new arena or this team's going to have to move. That's interesting, going all the way back to 82, 83, and seeing that there about almost 15 years before they actually move. So the Jets having some money trouble, and things get worked out between then and then later on. Of course, they moved to Arizona. The Canucks are back to reality. So they went to the Stanley Cup Final in 82, which set the bar way too high. They're still a middling franchise, and yet there's fingers already being pointed at Roger Nielsen. And talk about how, well, Nielsen takes over a team and they have a really short time where they're really, really good and he makes the team look better than they are, and then they fall back to reality, and then he ends up getting fired. Nielsen goes through a lot of teams over his career as a coach. And I liked Roger Nielsen as a coach. I was always baffled when he got fired, but it's that kind of job where you get hired to be fired. Lanny McDonald scores 66 for the Calgary Flames, who seem to be making some progress. And Kent Nilsson gets 104 points, but he's being criticized for inconsistent play, especially during the playoffs. So they escape the first round against the Canucks, and then in round two they face Edmonton. And that's where you're going to see some criticism thrown at Calgary players. Battle of Alberta, right? So that's an interesting storyline, and it continues into the next season. I believe the next year was the last year for Nilsson in Calgary. L.A., oh boy. The L.A. Kings are a disaster. Infighting between coaches and players, and former assistant coach Brad Selwood, who was let go May of that season. So after that season was over, comes out and says, basically, I'm not going to go into the whole quote because some of it's kind of, I don't think I can say that now. Not exactly something you can say publicly. But he basically says Mike Murphy and Marcel Dion are the only hardworking guys for the Kings. And then says, if they have visions of Stanley Cups in their heads, they'd best take a trip to the Hall of Fame to see it. It's right there in the display case. So that's pretty bad coming from an assistant coach after being let go by the team to say, yeah, these guys are just basically all idiots and there's two good players on the team and everybody else should go. And it just shows just how bad things were for the Kings at that point. And the Smythe division's a disaster. You got Winnipeg falling back, complaints about Dale Hawerchuk not being good enough defensively. The Canucks fall back to earth. You've got the Flames that seem to be getting better, but really it's the Oilers and everybody else. The Chicago Blackhawks, however, are riding high. They get a division title. Denny Savard has 121 points, and Steve Larmer with 90 points wins the Calder as Rookie of the Year. Orville Tessier, during the season, there are chants that he should be the mayor of Chicago. So it's a good time for Chicago. It's not going to last, but it's interesting to see it from this season's perspective. And yeah, Steve Larmer, a guy that we don't talk about enough in hockey history. He had a really, really strong start offensively. The North Stars are falling back. They're no longer contenders. They get knocked out early in the playoffs again. And at this point, it's happened so many times. 82 and 83, it's happened twice. They did go to the finals in 81, but they weren't a playoff juggernaut before 81 either. So because there was just that one-off where they went to the finals, people are starting to see that maybe Minnesota's not as great as was expected, and they're not that future champion as was expected. The Toronto Maple Leafs, horrible up until Christmas. Absolutely garbage until Christmas, but they're above 500 after Christmas. And they managed to eke their way into a pretty decent run towards the end of the year. And there's a lot of hope. And a lot of this comes from a guy they get from Montreal. That's right, Montreal's giving away good players again. Dan Daoust ends up going to the Toronto Maple Leafs and becomes their number one center right away. So that shows A, Montreal mismanaging an asset, and B, Toronto desperately needing somebody to be their first line center. That's where you would expect Builder Lego, but, you know. Dan Daoust is a hero after that trade from Montreal. They also acquired Gaston Gingras, and he had a pretty decent run as far as I remember with Toronto as well. So yeah, Toronto, things look good. Looks like they're on their way up. We'll get into the next history video about how they're not. But it was hopeful at the time. St. Louis did not draft in 1983. They weren't at the draft, and there was talk about them moving to Saskatoon. The reality was they were very unlikely to actually move to Saskatoon. The NHL stepped into that right away and said, you're not going to Saskatoon. No. But the idea of them maybe not playing in St. Louis anymore was a very realistic option at that point until they found a new owner. So they found a new owner. He takes over, and you can wipe the sweat off your brow if you're in St. Louis because the team stays as the St. Louis Blues. But it's amazing because, you know, just in yesterday's and the previous day, not yesterday's, I didn't do this yesterday, a couple days ago and before that, other entries in this, we've talked about St. Louis and Mike Liut and how they're doing well, and now it's just all fallen apart rather quickly. And Detroit is now up to 2 playoff appearances in 16 years. That's a long time. And this is in an era where there's only 5 teams out of 21 missing the playoffs, and Detroit's very regularly there. And GM Jimmy Devellano, all he has to say is, we just want to make the playoffs. We can just make the playoffs something. And the magazine agrees, hey, that's where they need to get is the playoffs, and then we can talk about them getting better. But in 83, what people don't know yet, it's about to get better because they draft Steve Yzerman in the first round. So this will go towards Detroit becoming a whole heck of a lot better, but not yet. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video, and hey, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.